Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to P&P Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we're delighted to have with us this evening veteran columnist George Will to talk about his latest collection of pieces, American Happiness and Discontents, the Unruly Torrent, 2008 to 2020. A couple of brief housekeeping notes first, though. To post a question at any point, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. In the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing copies of American Happiness and Discontents. George, of course, writes a twice-weekly syndicated column for the Washington Post and has now completed 5 decades as a columnist. His commentary won journalism's highest award, the Pulitzer, early in his career in 1977. But he's gone on to compose thousands of additional distinctive columns, 6,000 or so over his career. He's also turned out a number of books. American Happiness and Discontents is his 16th. As anyone who has followed George's life knows, he derives his most fun from baseball. But writing ranks second, and the pleasure shows in his work, which continues to exhibit, as one reviewer put it, the sharp, discerning prose. And the range of his subjects is evident in his latest collection, which is divided into chapters on history, politics, the courts, science, economics, culture, and academia. There are pieces, too, about books. Thank you, George. And, of course, sports. Plus tributes to more than a dozen people who passed away. As a reviewer in the Washington Post said, the columns featured in this book confirm that George is, quote, still a brilliant prose craftsman, as well as a keen and dyspeptic political observer. Added the reviewer, love him or loathe him, there is no one else like him. So George, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for hosting this. I think what I'll do is begin tonight in a way that I'm not inclined to begin things, that is with a little autobiographical swoop. I make a point, about 20 years ago, I decided never again to use in a column the first person singular I, referring to myself. It seems to be lazy writing and calls attention to the writer rather than to the subject. So I try not to drag myself into columns, but perhaps some of the people with us tonight would be interested in how I got here. I explained some of this in the introduction to the book, but when I got ready to finish my 2 years at Oxford in 1964, I had to decide what to do with the rest of my life. My father was a college professor, a professor of philosophy and the philosophy of science at the University of Illinois. And I applied to Harvard Law School and to Princeton in philosophy in the graduate college. I think I probably went to Princeton because it's midway between 2 National League cities, the Phillies and the Mets. Gives you some idea of what a serious scholar I was. It's one of life's close calls, but for that, I would be a lawyer today. I had actually 3 careers in short order. I did teach briefly at Michigan State University and the University of Toronto. And then I worked on the Senate staff for 3 years, and then I became a columnist. So in short order, I had 3 careers, which is kind of interesting because my father asked me before I went over to Oxford, he said, what do you want to do? Do you want to be like your hero, Murray Kempton, the columnist? Or would you like to be a political staffer like Ted Sorensen, who was a big deal with Jack Kennedy at the time? Or would you like to be someone like Isaiah Berlin, who was a family friend, a philosopher? By the time I was early 30s, I'd done all 3, not as well as Murray Kempton as a columnist, and not nearly with the profundity of Isaiah Berlin. But I had work. What happened was I was teaching at the University of Toronto, and Everett Dirksen died, who was the senator from Illinois, who was the Republican leader in the Senate. They shuffled the Republican leadership, and the Republican senator of whom I had never heard, Gordon Allott of Colorado, became 3rd ranking chairman of the policy committee, and he said, I would like to hire a Republican academic to write for me. Well, of course, there were no Republican academics then as now, practically, but this was the late 60s, and we were particularly scarce on the ground at that time. But through serendipity, he found me. I came to work on the Senate staff, worked with him for 3 years. I was going to leave at the end of 3 years anyway, but at the end of 3 years, he lost, which is not easy to do. He lost in Colorado in 1972, while Nixon was carrying Colorado by something like 26 points and was carrying 49 states. Nevertheless, with my political prowess, I helped Gordon Allett lose. And I had already called Bill Buckley, for whom I'd written a few things, and said, I think you need what you've never had before, a Washington editor of National Review. And Bill essentially said, you're right, I do, and you're it. He said, could you edit the back of the book, meaning the book review section? And I said, sure. I had no idea what I was talking about. But that was Bill Buckley to a T. He liked to collect young people he thought might have promise and run with us. When I became a columnist, I asked Bill the question that I now know, having been a columnist for half a century, is the most commonly asked question of columnists, which is, how do you come up with topics to write about? I asked that to Bill, and he said, the world irritates me 3 times a week. I would modify it to say the world irritates or interests me or amuses me twice a week. I write 100 columns a year now. I used to write more when I was doing back page of Newsweek also and National Review. But it used to be, it was said of Napoleon that he could not look at a landscape without seeing a battlefield. That's just what he was. He was, and it seems to me a columnist, if he's going to be happy in his or her work, can't look at the world around him without being bombarded with column topics. There has never, I think, been a moment in 50 years that there haven't been 3 or 4 things I wanted to write about that day. I've always carried in my wallet a little bit of a 3x5 card on which there are scribbled topics that I hope to get to soon. And I've got one in my wallet now. Being a columnist is an odd business because most Americans, even before new media and digitizing and all that, most Americans do not read newspapers. And only a minority of the minority who read newspapers read the op-ed pages. Just a fact. Now, this depresses some columnists. I find it liberating and exhilarating. What it means is that the kind of people who come of their own volition to the op-ed page bring, I think, with a mental pantry well stocked with information and opinions so that you don't need to reinvent the wheel with them. You don't say, by the way, there are 3 branches of government and judicial review, et cetera, et cetera. This is an intellectually upscale audience that reads columns. And so you can assume a lot on their part, and you can write with obliquely and with intimations that help you cover a lot of material, if you're careful with it, in 750 words, which is a limit I adhere to quite strictly. Columnists are very different. One of the happiest compliments I've ever received was from someone who had come to the Washington Post to be a fact checker at the syndicate, the Washington Post Writers Group. And she said to me, I had no idea how many facts there are in your columns, which pleased me because we're on what they call the opinion pages, but I like to think that my columns are about 90% facts with opinions thrown in. I remember once Bill Buckley and I sat next to one another on a plane. I'll tell you how old it was, with the Eastern Shuttle. Former British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan had been in town at the Smithsonian, and Bill and I had gone to see him separately. And each of us wrote columns about this. And Bill and I were going back together to New York to a National Review editorial board meeting. And at that time, it was 38 minutes, wheels up to wheels down on the Eastern Shuttle from Washington to New York. Wheels up, Bill took out his Olivetti typewriter, another bit of ancient history. And by the time the wheels were down, he'd written his column. I'm pretty fluent, but I'm not like that because I write a different kind of column. One of the things I tried to emphasize in the book you've got are the courts. I think my columns are collectible because, and this is my 9th collection, because as a lapsed political philosopher, I actually think I'm doing political philosophy anyway. I think I try to find a kernel of larger principle or significance in daily events. Daniel Boorstin, the great historian who was just a wonderful, wonderful writer, and he was the Librarian of Congress. Daniel Boorstin in the 1950s, when there was a lot of talk about the consensus theory of American history, we certainly got over that. Dan said, we don't do political philosophy in the United States because there's such a consensus about our Lockean liberalism. I think he's mistaken. I think we do political philosophy all the time. We just do it in constitutional law. Constitutional lawyers in the Supreme Court, producing the Supreme Court reports, or producing an ever-growing body of American political philosophy. I also disagreed with Dan because it seems to me the Federalist Papers are every bit as good political philosophy. Newspaper columns, by the way, written in haste for the practical purpose of trying to get New York ratifying convention to ratify the Constitution. I think the Federalist Papers are right up there with the Leviathan and Locke's Second Treatise as great works of political philosophy. But anyway, the court section might interest you because people sometimes ask, what have you changed your mind about in 50 years? And the most important one is the role of courts. When I came to Washington in 1970, I was, like a lot of conservatives, I was somewhat put off by the freewheeling jurisprudence of the Warren Court, which invented a lot of rights out of whole cloth and was, I thought, untethered to the text and structure of the Constitution. So I adopted the rhetoric of judicial restraint. It's majoritarian rhetoric. It's deference of the judicial branch to majoritarian institutions, be they city councils or the United States Congress. I changed my mind about that, but it's interesting. I changed my mind that really took me back to graduate school. Let me explain. Judicial review and courts are supposed to exemplify what Alexander Bickel, the great law professor at Yale, and my good friend Bob Bork, who was a majoritarian on the Oliver Wendell Holmes tradition, they said that judicial review and the courts present a counter-majoritarian dilemma. Well, I just decided I don't see what the dilemma is. Oliver Wendell Holmes was such a majoritarian, he's famously said, if the American people want to go to hell, I will help them. It's my job. Well, I disagree, and here's why. I grew up in Champaign County, Illinois, University of Illinois there. And according to local law, it was in the Champaign County Courthouse, a great Midwestern block of red sandstone from Indiana, that it was in the Champaign County Courthouse that Abraham Lincoln, a very prosperous traveling railroad lawyer, learned that Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas had passed through the Senate the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was his attempt to solve the crisis of the 1850s, which was, what should we do about the question of can people bring their slaves into the territories, such as Kansas and Nebraska? Stephen A. Douglas said, the important thing is that majority have its way. Vote it up, vote slavery up, vote slavery down. It's a matter of indifference. The morally important point is that majority rules. Lincoln's ascent to greatness was in his recoil against this. Lincoln said, nope, America's not about a process, majority rule, it's about a condition, liberty. And building upon that, I have revised my view. I think judicial restraint and judicial deference to majoritarian institutions very often is judicial dereliction of duty, that a constitution, a written constitution, is inherently counter-majoritarian, if you will. The first words of the First Amendment say Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech, etc. Congress shall make no law, even if majorities want it. Too bad you can't have it. And in a way, this took me back to where I was in 1964 when I got to graduate school and I had to write a doctoral dissertation. The title of my doctoral dissertation was Beyond the Reach of Majorities. That is a phrase from Justice Jackson's opinion in the second flag salute case. The first one, Minersville v. Gobitis in 1939, written by Felix Frankfurter, which is interesting, said, the state of Pennsylvania can indeed compel Jehovah's Witnesses to salute the flag at the beginning of the school day, even though it violates their conscience. Now, I sympathize with Frankfurter. He was a Jewish immigrant from Vienna. War clouds were lowering over the world. He was concerned about national unity and patriotism. He'd seen in his native Vienna school children treated differently because of their religion and injured. But for just 4 years later, the Supreme Court in West Virginia v. Barnett reversed itself, just flat out reversed. And writing for the majority, Justice Jackson said, the very purpose of a Bill of Rights is to place certain things beyond the reach of majority to raise them above the vicissitudes of politics. So I think you'll find, and some will disagree and some will agree, but I think that I'm now firmly in the camp of what we who are in the camp call judicial engagement. Majoritarian rule, courts yielding to majoritarian institutions is a progressive belief, and generally in this century. And the people here tonight listening to me talk know full well I am, whatever else I am, is not a progressive. I wrote almost very rarely about the preceding president, and my friends at the Washington Post used to ask me to write more about him because when I did, I lit up the scoreboard of they have a scoreboard that tells them how many people are reading what in real time. But my approach as a columnist is that if I don't write 10 columns a year on books, I'm not doing my job. If I don't write a third of my columns on subjects that are not only not above the fold of the front page of the Washington Post, they're not even in the Washington Post that day. If I don't write about cultural matters, I'm not doing my job, because I do subscribe to the axiom, I think it's a truism, that politics is downstream from culture. Politics is what the Marxists used to call an epiphenomenon, and often it's a cork bobbing on more powerful undercurrents. I suppose the column in this collection that occasioned most turmoil was my full-throated denunciation of denim, blue jeans, the plague of denim. I wrote after decades of sitting on airport concourses, and a father, 42-year-old father, would walk by with his 12-year-old son, and they're both dressed exactly alike. Running shoes, blue jeans, t-shirt. And if his mother's there, she's wearing blue jeans. And I said to myself, there was a time when we had clear stages of growth, when we, in the words of 2 Corinthians, put away childish things. And when putting them away, we put away childish dress. And we dressed like adults. We weren't trying to be just big children. We weren't trying to be the buddies of our children. So I wrote a lot about that in this book. In fact, I've got 3 on music. I've got 1 on Frank Sinatra, comparing, among other things. This was written on the centennial of his birth. Among other things, the elegance of the Great American Songbook lyrics. For example, his wonderful song, "The summer wind came blowing in from across the sea. It lingered there and touched your hair. You walked with me," etc. I said, that's somehow superior to "I can't get no satisfaction." And it's worth cherishing the superiority of things. My friend Harvey Mansfield, who's justly famous as the conservative at Harvard, has said the purpose of education is to learn how to praise. People say, well, no, it's supposed to learn critical thinking. Well, sure, critical thinking, but criticism doesn't just mean criticizing or denigration. It can mean praise. And what Harvey means is praise is to hold people up to standards and say they fulfill certain standards. And it causes you to affirm the existence of standards. I also wrote about the Beach Boys. I was a great Beach Boys fan back in the day. And I went to see, they were out at, I don't know, Shady Grove, I guess, on their 50th anniversary tour. The Beach Boys, all in their 70s. They could have been the Beach Geezers at this point. But I went out to see them, and I sort of wrote a column about how popular music seems to cue baby boomer nostalgia, of which we have quite enough. Thank you very much. I also wrote a column about Bob Dylan on the occasion of his winning the Nobel Prize for Literature, which puzzled me a lot. But then I consulted with my friend who wrote a book about Dylan, my friend Sean Valance, who's one of America's greatest American historians these days, who grew up in Greenwich Village at the sort of the period of folk song concentration down there. And turns out I thought it was, the prize was defensible. So that's some of the stuff I write about. It's tremendous fun to write columns. I would explode if I didn't. I mean, it's a metabolic urge of mine to write. When Henry James lay on his deathbed dying, he was on his back and there was a sheet up almost to his neck. It is said that as he was dying, his hand was moving like that in a writing motion over his chest. I expect on my deathbed to be doing much the same thing. In fact, I wrote all of my columns beginning when I started in 1973 in longhand with a fountain pen on tablets, because I enjoyed the physical, tactile pleasure of assembling paragraphs. Then one day, winter's day in 1994, the Major League Baseball strike talks, that was the year we lost the World Series to a strike, were going underway in the Mayflower Hotel. I was doing This Week with David Brinkley across DeSalle Street in the ABC building. And after one of our shows, I walked across the icy street, broke my arm. Our guest that day on the program, then Congressman John Kasich of Ohio, drove me to the hospital. I came home, pointed to the computer to my wife and said, show me how to turn that on. Wrote 12 columns in 12 days. It came so fast with computers. So it's one of those fortunate accidents that I broke my arm. The fact that I enjoy this so much indicates that one of the principles of my life is maybe flawed. My principle is that price theory sorts out society rationally. The problem with that is that I'm paid to do something I would pay to do. So the price theory is not working in my case. It enables me to get off my chest certain things. And I'd like to talk a little bit about this before I subside. I am puzzled by how we began to produce children. And I have 4 children. How we began to produce children who, when they go to college, want freedom, not freedom of speech, but freedom from speech that might discombobulate their emotional equilibrium. Who get to college and want safe spaces where they can cower while bias response teams fan out across the campus to stamp out microaggressions and other things that might trigger them. How did this come about? It interests me. And so I thought, well, it must have something to do with parenting. And I'm interested in the fact, I think it's within the last 20 years or so, about 20 years ago, the good solid noun parent began to become a verb. Parenting is an activity. We parent. And that led slowly but surely to the idea that parenting is an exact science, something like calculus. Difficult, but if you master it correctly, you will have something like parental determinism. If you do it right, you will produce wonderful, awesome children, and we'll all live in Lake Wobegon where all the children are above average. And we will, if you wish, you will be able to, in the nature versus nurture argument, you can push nature aside. You can say it's all nurture, it's all skillful parenting. And as a result, you can send your child, lo and behold, off to Princeton and on to Goldman Sachs, if that's the trajectory you want for them. But anyway, it's possible for sufficiently skillful parenting to determine the trajectory of children. Now, I think people who believe that have not raised enough children. All the parents in our audience tonight know that children have their own inner compass and their own trajectories, but there you are. I do think the way we parent today, however, has produced this odd kind of fragile child, the bubble wrap child, the children who grow up with helicopter parents hovering over them, children who grow up with insufficient unsupervised play, where they get in trouble and they get in arguments and they have difficulties and they have failures and they have to solve these failures, they have to recover on their own without their parents doing it for them. That's called growing up, or it used to be. I remember when I was young in Champaign, Illinois in the summer, I'd have breakfast, walk out the back door, and my mother'd say, come back for lunch if you're hungry, if not, see you at dinner. And we would roam free, great gaggle of children working things out together. Today, it's even got a name. It's called free range parenting. It used to be just called being a child. And I think it worked for a great many of us. As I say, I have a metabolic urge to write it, and I would probably explode if I couldn't write. Early on in my life, I decided maybe I'd be a sports writer. This was because I loved baseball, and baseball didn't love me back. I had zero talent. I played Little League. That was my peak. I did a peak at age 12 playing Little League with the Mittendorf Funeral Home Panthers in Champaign, Illinois. Our color, of course, was black. If memory serves, they put me out in right field because the assumption was that I could do less damage out there. The ball wouldn't find me so often. But I wanted to be a sports writer, and one of my models early on was Red Smith, who was one of those who found writing difficult. He said, all you have to write is there's nothing to it. You just open a vein and bleed. Scotty Reston, the great columnist from the New York Times and New York Times bureau chief for many years, once told me that he found writing columns so difficult and so actually kind of painful that he had trouble sleeping the night before a day when he was going to have to write a column. I find that incomprehensible because, as I say, there's nothing more fun for me than writing. Those of you who might have read the portion from the introduction of my book that the Post ran the other day will know about the person I'm about to refer to, Murray Kempton. When I went to a University of Education Department high school at the University of Illinois, where we took 7th and 8th grade in 1 year. So I arrived at college. I went to Trinity College in Hartford because they had a scholarship for Illinois boys. It was an all-male school then. And I arrived at Trinity College just 4 months after my 17th birthday and did what a lad from Central Illinois would do. I went down to New York on the New York, New Haven and Hartford Railroad to see the big city. Got off the train, walked through that magnificent Grand Central Terminal waiting room, plunked down a nickel, which is what it cost, and bought a New York Post, in which I read a column by Murray Kempton. And I said, wow. By the way, Murray only wrote about 670 words usually in a column, but it was magnificent. It was wonderfully written, droll, witty, insightful. And I said, gosh, what fun this must be. I think maybe if I hadn't spent that nickel right then, I wouldn't be a columnist today. Maybe not. I probably would have found this vocation anyway, but it was fun. Murray had a very distinctive prose style, and he knew exactly where it came from. He said it came from reading Lord Clarendon's History of the Great Rebellion in England, the English Civil War, Cromwell and all that. This is a book, 3 centuries old, but Murray Kempton got around to reading it. But it shaped Murray. I think Murray Kempton influenced my prose style, and I know that P.G. Wodehouse shaped mine. I was in Bermuda once in the 70s. I'd spent 2 years in England and never read P.G. Wodehouse. Bought a Wodehouse book, was so delighted. In the next 3 or 4 years, I read 73 of his novels. I've got them all in the other room. I'm not all ashamed to say that to some extent, I think my prose style is derivative, but that's all right. I've told you one compliment I got in my life that I really liked, the one about lots of facts in my column. I'll tell you an early compliment I got, and then I'll subside. When I was working for National Review, I dealt with Priscilla Buckley, who was Bill's sister, who really ran the magazine. She was put it all together. And she once told me that if my copy had come in without my name on it, she would have known it was mine because I'd found a tone of voice. And I think that's what every writer aspires to have. Well, I have talked long enough. I'm quite tired of the sound of my own voice and eager to hear from questions that you folks might have. So I'm going to subside and welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, George. We have a couple questions, so let me invite, while these are being asked, let me invite all of you watching to add some more questions. You're welcome to just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen, and we'll ask them as they come in. So the first question, what is your opinion on the court's decision not to block the Texas abortion laws?
I think it was an entirely procedural question. It had nothing to do with the merits of the policy or the law itself. The law was written perversely to give people a private right of action. These are called private attorney general's laws, to give ordinary citizens a right of action to enforce a law against abortion. And this was written deliberately to get around clear Supreme Court precedents. Now, I don't care whether you love Roe v. Wade or hate Roe v. Wade, there it is. And if the court wants to overturn Roe v. Wade, which it'll have a chance to consider doing this fall when it has oral arguments in the case out of Mississippi, it can do so, just as the court has reversed itself on separate but equal racial segregation, just as the court did so on what I talked about earlier tonight, the flag salute cases. But the Texas law, which the court allowed to stand only because it had not yet been challenged. The question was, who would they be overturning? The state of Texas? State of Texas isn't technically involved, and don't look at us. We're not doing anything to anybody. So I think people got all hot and bothered about what the Supreme Court did, but the Supreme Court says, just wait a minute. Someone will bring us a case, and the case has already been, I think, started. Someone has started, a doctor has said, I performed an abortion, come and get me. This is how you wind up with court cases. So I think the whole Texas law will be a mere sideshow to the main event, which is coming on the Mississippi case, which will be decided probably in June 2022 in the midst of a off-year political campaign, which would make things very exciting indeed.
The next question's from Lori, who's been an admirer of your work for 40 years. Her question is, how do you manage to keep so many facts, figures, names, historical events in your mind, to access them so seemingly easily? Seriously, do you do exercises to keep your mind and memory sharp?
Well, no. First of all, I'm a baseball fan. And I don't know why this 3-pound blob, the human brain, gathers this sort of lint, but I know Wayne Terwilliger played for the Cubs second base in 1950. I know that Jim Constanti pitched 1-0 and lost the first game of the 50 World Series to Vic Raschi of the Yankees. It's a sickness. Baseball does that to you. So first of all, I grew up absorbing baseball numbers and names and stuff. But also I read all the time. People say, what do you do? I could say I'm a writer. Actually, it'd be more accurate to say I'm a reader. I spend more time reading than writing. I get up every morning at 5:20. At 5:21, I'm listening to an Audible book. I have on my phone here, I probably have 30 books on there right now. And I listen while shaving, and I go for my morning exercise walk of a couple of miles, listening to books on tape, recorded books. I listen while I'm having breakfast, while I'm commuting to my office in Georgetown. I go through 2.5, 3 hours of listening to books every day in otherwise wasted time, go through maybe 80 books a year in otherwise wasted time. Don't worry, politics and prose. I always buy the hard copy of the book I'm listening to because I want to underline it. The facts that Lori asked about. So if you're always reading, and if you're a writer voracious for material, Henry Kissinger famously said, when you come to Washington, you start running down your intellectual capital because there's no time to replenish it. Well, that's just not true. I have to, or I'd long since have been out of gas. Pat Moynihan, who became my best friend while he was here as senator from New York many, many years. I once said rather rudely that while he was in the Senate, he wrote more books than many of his colleagues read. He found time to produce a book every few years while in the Senate, and they're well worth reading.
George, you're hardly alone in reading by listening. These days, the category of audiobooks is one of the fastest growing in the book business. And it was that before the pandemic. And you can imagine how much the pandemic's given it a boost. We have a couple of more questions on process. Bill asks, how long does an idea percolate in your mind before you choose to write a column on it? Can you recall an issue for which you thought about writing a column and chose not to and now regret it?
I can't think one of those. I can think some I thought of writing about and did write and then regretted it because I wrote foolishly. I think in one of my more extreme libertarian moments, I said we simply ought to decriminalize prostitution, sex work as it's now called, and I think that wasn't wise. We have actually, as a society, done that with selective enforcement and all the rest, which may be a good thing, but I was insufficiently sensitive to what happens to certain neighborhoods, including certain neighborhoods of this Washington, which I actually love, the city. So I could have done better, but no, I can't think of any. I find that, I mentioned that little card in my pocket that has the topics I want to get to. Some of them I won't get to for 6 months because news keeps interrupting the flow of my own preferences. And to me, it's often the case I don't write to say what I think. I write to find out what I think because it's in working out how to write about court cases, for example. I mean, I write 20 columns a year based on court cases. Often I've written one recently on an oral argument that's coming up. I'm going to write another one. It'll be in next Sunday's paper on an oral argument about court secrecy. One of the FISA courts that makes surveillance decisions don't publicize their opinions, and I think they should. Again, I often write to find out what I think. It's not that I don't have a full skull full of opinions, but my opinions don't interest me that much. I mean, they're mine and I'm familiar with them. I'd rather find new things to write about.
Catherine has a question related to Donald Trump. She asks, what might your opening line be if you find you must write a column in response to Donald Trump's announcing another presidential run?
Well, first, I will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid talking about him and also to avoid writing about him. So I have trouble contemplating that difficulty. I will find an interesting lead sentence if that comes about. You know, there's nothing more optional than reading a syndicated column. So if people are going to do it, you better, first of all, they're going to read the byline. So I like the way Will's mind works, or I don't like the way Will's mind works. Second, you better hook them with the first sentence. Americans are busy. Life grabs Americans by the lapel and shakes them all the time. Advertising, blasts from all-day radio and all-day television, news television. So you better hook them right away. So it better be a good lead about Mr. Trump. And it better be funny. I happen to think I'm funny. Now, a lot of people say, that's funny, thinking that Will is funny. But I like to think that almost all of my columns, something's going to make you smile. Often it makes me laugh while I'm writing them, but that's self-absorption of the journalistic narcissism, I suppose.
Now, Robert cites a recent Wall Street Journal profile that highlighted your column about your firstborn son. He says, please share more about him and his life as an adult.
Yes, John was born in Georgetown Hospital on my birthday in 1972, my 31st birthday. The next morning I came in and a pediatrician who we promptly fired without waiting for me to arrive, had told my wife that John had Down syndrome, which was unconscionable. We were shortly thereafter visited in the room by a Georgetown official, a priest, Jesuit, who said, the first question you have to answer is, are you going to take him home? We were rather nonplussed. We said, yes, I think that was what people did with their children. They took them home. Well, he asked that question because as recently as 1972, it was still considered acceptable to either institutionalize or put up for adoption less than perfect children. I've got 3 others since then, and none of them are perfect, trust me. So we took John home. Now, in 1972, the life expectancy of Down syndrome people, citizens, was about 20 years. Now, that's because they weren't mainstreamed in any way. They were warehoused often. They were considered hopeless cases. We were told that John would never learn to read anything, would never couldn't possibly use public transportation, might not even ever be toilet trained. It's all rubbish. John will be 50 next year on May 4th. John works in the Washington Nationals clubhouse pre-pandemic and after the pandemic is over, which means he gets up in the morning, goes from Major League Ballpark, which means he has a better job than I have. He whips around the city on the metro with much more confidence than I have, and encounters enormous kindness and understanding. He has an articulation problem, very hard to understand, but people are remarkably patient with him. He was partially mainstreamed at Walt Whitman High School and graduated there. I gave the commencement talk at his class. So he's had just a wonderful time. The two best things that ever happened to John, well, three best things were the Washington Metro, whatever the arena's called downtown, I forgot what name it has now, where the Wizards play, and the Caps, because he's a season ticket holder of the Caps, and to the Georgetown games, and he goes to Nationals Park. So he's got he's doing quite well, thank you. There's a column in there about not only about John's 40th birthday, but a column about Iceland being rather proud of itself that it's on the verge of solving what it calls the Down syndrome problem. And I said, well, I don't quite figure out how John is a problem, least of all to Iceland. Iceland's point was that because of prenatal testing, you can tell if your child has Down syndrome. And 90% of the women who have prenatal testing and discover that they have a Down syndrome child have an abortion, which I think is unfortunate. I think the world would be a nicer, sweeter place if there were more people like John, but that's just me. I think Iceland, when I wrote this, was down to 2 Down syndrome people, and seemed to me rather pleased with itself. It was extinguishing a category of human beings. There's a name for that. But anyway, it's in there. You can make up your own minds.
A couple more questions about your process. Brenda asks, do you have more than one column in process at the same time, or do you finish one before starting another?
Basically, I finish one before starting another, but sometimes I get really wound up and I can't stop. I get far ahead. I have written, a few years ago, I wrote 8 obituary columns on people that were elderly and were distinguished, and I would write a column. And as far as I can tell, it's an insurance policy. I mean, people ought to pay me to write them because they never die. I won't tell you who I've written. Well, I will. It's some of them. Jimmy Carter, Bob Dole, Margaret Thatcher, who did die, George Herbert Walker Bush, who did die, Henry Kissinger, Oscar Robertson, a great basketball player, has a very interesting life story. Did I mention Bob Dole? Anyway, lots of them. They're still in their arrows in my quiver, but and I'm not eager for them. But long may they live. The column is ready, however.
Bailey wants to know what's been the hardest column to write over your career. Also, your background is the epitome of bookshelf envy.
Well, if I read a book, I keep it, period. This is a source of some marital strife, but too bad. I've got lots of books. My Christmas present last year was 2 more circular rotating bookshelves to keep track. Well, I mean, I read about 7 feet of books a year, thanks to, again, to Audible books. So you can see this. I need a big house here in Chevy Chase Village. Sorry, refresh me at the beginning of that question.
The question is, what's been the hardest column to write over your career?
I can't think of ones that were particularly hard. But some have been difficult because I'm not a lawyer, although I play one on television. Wrapping my mind around some of the legal briefs I read are difficult. I had to write a column once that was kind of difficult. I got in a world of trouble in 1980 when I helped Ronald Reagan prepare for his debate with Jimmy Carter. And this was tied up with a controversy about whether Reagan had Carter's briefing book for his debate and all that. And I shouldn't have done it. It wasn't as though my support for Ronald Reagan was a state secret. It was quite clear who I was for. But it was fun, actually, being out there and realizing how little he needed preparation from pipsqueaks like me about how to debate. But Jimmy Carter, as recently as about 15 years ago, said on public radio that he lost the presidency because he lost the debate, and he lost the debate because George Will stole his briefing book. How I got into the White House and stole his briefing book, I do not know. But I think actually we know who took the briefing book, and it was a Kennedy operative, because the Kennedys, after the conflict between Ted Kennedy and Jimmy Carter, detested Carter, and they all voted for Reagan, I think, but that's another story.
Well, speaking of presidents, Jeffrey wants to know, do you regret voting for Joe Biden?
No, of course not. No. That was, life's full of close calls. That wasn't one of them. No, I mean, we had the national emergency. I mean, I disagree with Mr. Biden on almost everything, but that's life. That's he won 270 electoral votes. He gets to be president, and it was imperative that we change in 2020.
Well, I think we're down to the last question. This questioner asks, says, you're a man of words. What do you think about public discourse now? Causes and effects?
Well, public discourse is dreadful nowadays. First of all, because I don't know what's happened to traditions of rhetoric, aside from the fact that we don't teach rhetoric anymore. Time was, believe it or not, children learned the Gettysburg Address by heart. Think of that, 270 some words. And we declaim poetry and all, but we've put all that stuff aside. We now talk the way people do on television in short bursts. And discourse itself is being badly damaged by social media. I don't tweet. Someone in my office tweets out whatever characters it is, I don't know how many these days, twice a week from my column, but that's all. I'm told I have a Facebook page, but I've never seen it. I think I did a column recently on a law review article by Eugene Volokh, who's the curator of the Volokh Conspiracy website, which is libertarian-ish gathering of constitutional law professors. And he talked about the cost of cheap speech. Social media had made speech not only inexpensive, but cost-free. I mean, people can just, it used to be back in the bad old days when all we had were the mainstream media. And if you wanted to address a large audience, you had to get past editors who had responsibilities to their subscribers and to their advertisers and to the community. They had reputations to keep. Now the gatekeepers are gone. So you can be stark raving mad and brimming over with lunatic conspiracy theories, and you can just disseminate that stuff to instantly, cheaply to a large audience. And the internet encourages, by its instantaneousness and by its anonymity often, it encourages that which should not be encouraged, the vile aspects of human nature, vituperation, bullying, cruelty, etc. I think I used to believe that there's a kind of constant ratio of stupidity to the size of society, that was one of nature's constants. I'm not sure I believe that anymore. I think there may be more stupidity nowadays than there used to be, or maybe it's just that the social media gives such velocity to stupidity that it seems to be greater than ever before. The jury's still out on that, but it's worrisome.
Yeah, social media definitely is a factor.
Yeah.
Well, George, it's been really a very enjoyable hour, engaging, thoughtful, wide-ranging, just like your many columns. Thanks very much for spending time with us here this evening, and thanks to everyone watching for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing copies of American Happiness and Discontents, and we hope to have some signed copies available tomorrow after George stops by the the store to sign them. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.